The deep state is trying to get rid of President Trump, and this is not the first time they've tried to overturn the will of the voters. They tried this in the 1960s, and the only difference is that this time they're not using bullets. The deep state represents a danger to our democracy. Our government, which we the citizens elect and pay for, has no business trying to overthrow the will of the voters, especially not by murdering our duly elected president. However, that's what happened on November 22, 1963 in Dallas. My name is Steve Brown, and I wrote a book called The Deep State Rides Again. In that book, I lay out the case that the deep state got rid of President Kennedy in 1963 and is currently trying to get rid of President Trump. What was back then referred to as the Washington establishment and what we now call the deep state, or sometimes just the swamp, conspired to murder President John F. Kennedy. Having the government bureaucracy try to take over power from the existing leadership is not a new concept. This has been going on since the beginning of civilization. The deep state in the United States consists of the crooked politicians, the FBI, the Justice Department, the intelligence community, the mainstream media, and a few others. This hasn't changed much since the early 1960s. With a few relatively minor differences, the current crop of bad actors from these same institutions are still at it. The deep state that took out President Kennedy also included the Mafia, the Pentagon, and some anti-Castro Cuban exiles. Back then, the intelligence community was primarily the CIA. Now the U.S. intelligence community has grown to also include over a dozen other major intelligence agencies in addition to just the CIA. Other than those relatively minor differences, the deep state hasn't changed much in the last few generations. And the deep state is still trying to overturn the will of the voters. They still, a few generations later, have no intention of allowing democracy to work. They don't believe in our representative republic or our Constitution. They are doing everything in their considerable and growing power to substitute their agenda and policies for those of the duly elected president. And what is worse, they're still succeeding and getting away with it. They're not using bullets this time, which gives us the illusion of progress. But the deep state is still doing their best to either get rid of Donald Trump, our duly elected president, or stop him from implementing his agenda. While they're trying to have him thrown out of the White House, they're doing everything humanly possible, legal or otherwise, to make sure he's unable to implement the agenda he was elected on. The objective of the deep state hasn't changed in the last few generations. Whatever it takes, the deep state has no intention of allowing our elected leaders to exercise power unless their agenda is in line with that of the deep state. The deep state is doing this to President Trump because he had the nerve to challenge them. Like President Kennedy, President Trump persisted in believing that he was the elected president and not the deep state. He believed that the Constitution and the voters gave him the authority of the presidency. The deep state chose not to use bullets to take out our President Trump, but they threw everything else they could think of at him in an effort to keep him from winning the election and exercising power. The deep state launched a multi-level attack on Trump starting when he was still a candidate in 2016. They tapped his phones, made up fake documents, used those documents to start an illegal investigation, and used the investigation to try to find something they could use to not only have him thrown out of office, but also put in prison. At the same time, the mainstream media smeared Trump and his family at every opportunity. No matter what the question was, the media's answer was, Trump is bad. The deep state was doing this for several reasons. First, they disagree with almost every part of Trump's agenda. For example, he wanted to stop illegal immigration, and they wanted to continue illegal immigration. They're also doing this because they want to make an example out of Trump. They want to make sure that no one ever tries the same thing again. The deep state wants candidates from the establishment who either agree with them or who they can control. Trump was neither of those things. They wanted to both destroy him and make the process so ugly that no one else will dare to try to challenge them again. In one of the chapters of my book, I describe the multi-level attack on New Orleans District Attorney Jim Garrison. In the 1960s, the deep state launched a vicious multi-level attack on him for the same reasons. He tried to prosecute CIA asset Clay Shaw for conspiracy to murder JFK. If he had succeeded, it would have opened a huge can of worms. If Clay Shaw was guilty, then there was a conspiracy to murder JFK. If there was a conspiracy to murder Kennedy, who else was involved. If Clay Shaw was CIA, what was the CIA doing murdering the president? He challenged the deep state. They disagreed with his agenda, and they wanted to make an example of him so no one else would dare challenge them again. They went after him with, no pun intended, trumped-up charges and smears in the mainstream media. In my book, I lay out for the reader what happened in Dallas on November 22, 1963, when President Kennedy was murdered, the events that led up to it, and what happened after. The reader will find out who was behind the Kennedy assassination. I also lay out the reasons behind what happened and what motivated the major players like Lyndon Johnson and J. Edgar Hoover to participate in the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. Finally, I describe how our history is repeating and what we can do about it. In the book, I claim that many outrageous or shocking things happened. Then I spend a lot of time backing those claims up with facts. I claim, for example, that Lyndon Johnson shot his way into the White House. Then I spend a lot of time supporting that argument. I also claim that J. Edgar Hoover joined Johnson in the conspiracy to assassinate President Kennedy. Then I spent a lot of time supporting that argument. In the end, I believe the weight of the evidence supports my conclusions, but that will ultimately be for the reader to decide. The book is available on Amazon, Audible, and Apple iTunes in traditional print book format, Kindle, or Audible versions. If you like, you can also download a free PDF with the first few chapters at thedeepstateridesagain.com.